It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Weeks from Ohio, who's going to talk about the evolution of technology by means of artificial selection. Seems a highly appropriate topic for us, Stephen. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
All right. All right, can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for coming and for allowing me the opportunity to present my ideas on the evolution of technology. My background, I am an evolutionary ecologist and I study reproductive evolution. And I reached out several months ago to Professor Hodgson for some advice on possibly publishing a manuscript on the evolution of technology. And he suggested that presenting to you all would be a great way to get feedback. So here I am. So thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity. So the outline of my talk is, at first, I'm going to outline how I came to this question in the first place, and give you a little bit of background on that. Then I'll outline my understanding of how technology evolves from the literature that I was able to find on the topic, including the notion of replicators and interactors and technology evolution at the level of firms or companies. And then I will present what I think is an alternative hypothesis for artifact evolution at the level of the artifact itself, and thinking of the artifact as a phenotype and the instruction set for the build of the artifact as a genotype. And I'll outline that argument and then end with some testable predictions that I think one can make using this view of artifact evolution at the level of the artifact itself. So in the early 1980s, when I was starting out my interest in evolutionary biology, I read the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and it was very influential as to my thinking about evolutionary biology. But it's one of its later chapters I found to be quite intriguing, which is the chapter on memes, and this notion that there was evolutionary processes outside of biology that could be driven by the same kind of Darwinian processes we see in biology. And Dawkins brought up this notion of memes, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the ideas that transfer from one person to another. But the general idea that there are other regions in humans and human culture where the same processes that we study in biology are operating really was intriguing to me. And I think I've found the term universal Darwinism many years later, but that idea was always very interesting to me. So I teach a class on population biology, and near the end of the class, and it's very heavily steeped in natural selection, evolution by natural selection, I tasked the students with a prompt of, are there things that they can think of outside of biology that might have Darwinian evolutionary properties? And what I told them was, what you were looking for is something that has variation, and then a subset of those variants are selected by some kind of selective process that is non-random, and that then there's inheritance of some portion of those that are selected relative to those that are not selected. And I broke up the class into 4 groups. 2 of the groups came up with technology. And in fact, they talked about video equipment and cars. And they were immediately struck by the observation that these technologies have adapted, if you will, change over time to become better. And they correctly pointed out that there's variation among these technologies like VHS, Betamax, DVD, etc. for the video equipment, and then various types of cars from the Model T up to the current day types of cars. And then they noted that selection occurs by certain cars being selected by consumers over others. So 2 of the 3 portions of the prompt they were able to meet. The third about inheritance of some subset of those that are chosen having some heritable portion that is passed on from one time period to the next, they were not able to figure out. And I have to admit that I thought it was an interesting set of ideas that they had, but I also didn't think it really fit into the model, to be honest. But thinking about it over time, I had read a fair bit of Richard Dawkins' writings, not all of them, but a fair few. And I did note that he had a couple of examples of evolution outside of biology, ideas that he suggested. One was computer viruses that copy themselves through computers and can spread. And the other is what I mentioned before, memes, which are bits of information that are spread from one person to the other. In both cases, he discussed these as their own replicators, and computer viruses use computers to spread, and memes used human minds to spread. But the more I thought about memes, you can think alternatively that different ideas are just being selected among the range of ideas purposefully by humans to then spread, rather than the way that I had read his writings, that the memes were almost their own little entities spreading, kind of like computer viruses do. And if that's the case, you could make the same kind of argument for the set of instructions used to make video equipment and cars. So that made me think maybe those students were actually really onto something. So that's what got me to start exploring the literature on the evolution of technology. And I should note here, when I say technology, I'm specifically thinking just about artifacts, human-made products. And so I came across a fair few papers and book chapters and books and the like on the topic, and definitely noted that there was a lot of literature out there that did, in fact, suggest that technology and artifacts evolve in a pattern that's similar to what we see in biology. Not the same, but similar. This is a phylogeny that was used by Temkin and Eldridge in their 2007 publication, looking at cornet evolution over time. And this is the similar kind of phylogeny that we see in evolutionary biology, with some, important distinctions where you get kind of swapping of information across major lineages, which you don't commonly find in biology. But the notion here was that cornets can evolve in steps that are similar to kinds of steps we see in biology, and they have new types that build on previous types in stepwise fashion. I ran across several other articles, one by Petrosky in '92 that talked about the evolution of forks, from single knives to two knives to two-pronged forks up to the current day four-pronged fork. And he noted a incremental change over time and how forks were made and used by people to come up with a modern day four-pronged fork. I also ran across George Basala's book, Evolution of Technology, that was quite interesting. He talked about a whole suite of artifacts, hammers and transistors and engines, where he noted incremental changes in these artifacts that built on previous designs of those artifacts. And he was generally arguing that you could find evolutionary change incrementally rather than just single inventors inventing something out of the blue that was some major change in the artifact type. Aboriginal weapons was another thing that he talked about. And you can see, just like with cornets, incremental changes over time in these types of Aboriginal weapons. So from the literature that I read, at least, it definitely suggested that there was an overall feeling that artifacts, technology, evolved in a process similar to what we see in biology and potentially could be explained in a selective mechanism, a selective way that we see in biology through Darwinian processes. So the next set of information I was looking for was what is the current understanding of how technology artifacts evolve in a Darwinian way. Again, I read a number of papers, and I'm just pulling out a couple that I thought were the most influential to my thinking, at least. One is by Nelson, 2007, and he discussed the firm and how firms are making technologies. They collect money for the technologies. They compete with one another. Certain ones that make superior technologies make profits, others do not and have losses. And over time, certain firms do well relative to others. And then they feed some of that profit back into R&D development, and that helps drive technology change. After reading this, my questions were, what is being inherited from one generation to the next? And is firm turnover, so this competition among firms, sufficiently quick to explain the extremely high rates of technology evolution? So continuing, sorry, it's working, there we go. To read the literature, I came across the notion of interactors and replicators. And this was quite intriguing to me. So the interactor, as noted by Professor Hodgson, is a relatively cohesive entity that hosts replicators and interacts with the environment in such a way as to lead to changes in the population of interactors and their replicators. So the interactor is what I would consider a phenotype in biology, and that is what is interacting with the environment. And examples from Hodgson and Knudsen, their book was Business Firms, which I think is the most pertinent to artifact evolution, and then various other types of social organizations like tribes and families and universities and the like. So that would be an interactor. And then the interactor hosts replicators. And again, from Professor Hodgson's paper, description of replicators are program-like bits of information held by an interactor, which can represent adaptive solutions to problems and guide its development. So basically information inside the interactor that can be passed on over time. And some other terms for replicators were techniques, or routines, or even habits, which are driving the build of the technologies and how to sell the technologies in the firms, let's say. So this then described what is inherited as well as the interactor, the phenotype. So it had both the genotype and the phenotype. which I didn't find previously in the notion of a firm. So this is a similar idea, but more specific to what is being inherited. Again, after reading this information, these papers, a question arose as to how effective was the inheritance of the information in the techniques or routines over time. And from within Hodgson's and Knudsen's book in 2010, they did note that it is difficult to show that routines are inherited with great fidelity. So routines or techniques don't necessarily pass from one time period to the next very efficiently. And again, that leads to the question of can this type of inheritance completely explain the very quick evolution of artifacts? Because you need efficient replication of the information to have selection be efficient. So that led me to the question, is there another type of Darwinian process operating in addition to this firm-to-firm kind of competition and inheritance of routines and the like that might also help explain the very quick evolution of artifacts? So I'm going to hopefully outline to you an understandable, what I think is a new hypothesis for how artifacts evolve. And this is a view from the perspective of the artifact itself. So I need to do the same thing that I prompted my students to do, which is I have to outline variation, in this case in the artifacts, heritability of some portion of that variation, and then outline a process that will lift certain variant types, certain artifact types over others. And that would then allow Darwinian selection of artifacts. So let's start with artifact variation. This is the simplest one to prove or show. And if we go back to what the students were talking about, artifacts usually come in lots of different variant types. So on the open market, there's lots of types of cars, of sedans, there's lots of types of video equipment to choose among. So showing artifact variation is pretty straightforward. The next one is heritability of some portion of the variation that I just showed for, let's say, cars. I'm going to dip into evolutionary biology, specifically something called quantitative genetics, if you're familiar with that at all. This is a simple equation from quantitative genetics, which suggests that the total phenotypic variation in a population, and in this case, we would talk about the total artifact variation, comprises genetic variation plus something called environmental variation. So what is the artifact analog of genetic variation? I am arguing it's the instruction set used to build the artifact. So going to something simpler than cars, let's talk about banana bread. So these are 3 types of banana bread that I just found on the internet. So these are 3 recipes for banana bread. And the recipes, which would be, I'm arguing it's the instruction set for how to build a banana bread, has 2 parts to it. One is the ingredients and their amounts. And then the second part is how you process those ingredients. So I'll show that in the next slide. So you can see the variation between these banana breads, I'm arguing, is due at least in part to the different recipes. And I've outlined in the same color the the recipes that have the same ingredients and the same amounts. So you can see recipe 1 and 2 has a lot of overlap in type and amount. Recipe 2 and 3 has a bit of overlap. The areas that are not outlined would be different in terms of either quantities and or types of ingredients. So recipe 2 has 3 ingredients that neither of the other 2 recipes have. So that's part of the instruction set. One can argue possibly that within the instruction set, these might actually be almost akin to genes, but I don't want to get into that at this point. And then the second part of the instruction set would be how you process those ingredients to build the banana bread. And once again, I've outlined in the same color the similarities between the different recipes, but then there's obviously a lot of differences between the 3 recipes. So my argument would be that the instruction set would be the heritable portion of the differences that are shown here in these 3 banana bread types. And obviously, just looking at them, there's taste differences and the like also. But my argument is the recipes are going to be the instruction sets, and that's going to be the heritable portion of the variation in banana breads, for example. Environmental variation might be something you haven't considered. That is any portion of the build of the artifact that is not specified in the instruction set. In biology, it's basically modifications of the phenotype due to the environment in which the organism is developing. But in artifacts, I would say it is any part of the build of the artifact that is not specified by the instruction set. So what does that mean? Let's, again, use banana bread. So those recipes don't specify what ovens to use. They don't specify what specific types of ingredients to use. And they don't specify the person who's baking it, as well as other things. So if the oven that is used to cook the banana bread, if it confers some kind of difference in the phenotype, in the final outcome of the banana bread, that is what we call environmental variation. It's not specified, and therefore can add variation to the artifact population that cannot be selected for. They use butter and flour, but there's lots of different types of butter and there's lots of different types of flour. If they're not specifically noting some particular type of Land O'Lakes butter or some particular type of Pillsbury flour, individuals using different types of butter and flour could come up with slightly different variants of the banana bread. And that variation is not heritable. It's environmental variation. And then I'm sure you're familiar with this, that different people can have a major impact on the outcome of any kind of baked good. So if you don't specify, and of course, if you're industrially producing banana bread, then it would be machines. But if it's baked by individuals, then they can have a major impact on the outcome of banana bread, and that is not heritable. So these kinds of influences on the artifact would be considered environmental variation and not be heritable. So going back to the quantitative genetics ideas, heritability in quantitative genetics, which is defined as H squared, is basically the proportion of the total phenotypic variation that is due to the genetic variation. So for artifacts, it would be the total phenotypic variation in the artifact that is specified by the instructions. All right, so hopefully you're buying that. So that would be my argument for the heritability of artifact variation. And the last part is a selective process that will lift superior artifacts at the expense of inferior ones. And this is basically, in my mind, and I've read this, so it's not unique to me, it's the artifact being sold to customers on the open market. And the customers themselves would be doing artificial selection, using the term as outlined by Darwin to compare it to natural selection. So going back to cars, the consumers are going to drive the evolutionary changes, the selective process for which car varieties are chosen over others by purchasing certain types of cars. So to diagram what I'm talking about here, I'm going to compare it to what I know in biology and try to make a comparison in artifact evolution. So in biology, individuals encounter the environment. They have some ability to acquire energy from the environment. Some of that energy is used as what we call maintenance energy, basically to keep running essentially as an organism. And then extra energy is used for growth and reproduction. All right, so that's what's going on at a very, very simplistic level in biology. In artifacts, what I would suggest, and this again has been suggested by others, that artifacts are sold on the open market. They gain energy, if you will, by their sales in terms of money. Some of that money is used to pay for the build of the artifact, but then there's profit on top of those resources needed just to build the actual artifact. Then those profits can be used for reproduction or other uses for profits, like paying off investors and the like. So that's the skeleton of this argument, but let's expand this a little bit more. So what is reproduction? So in biology, reproduction results in offspring that start out as zygotes, single-celled fertilized eggs. Then that cell then replicates itself repeatedly, depending on the type of organism, to build an individual. And then that would be the phenotype that could be selected by the environment and how well it does at energy acquisition, essentially. In artifacts, reproduction would be using some of the profits to make more artifacts. And if we go back to cars would be built in a factory, right? And so some of the profits are used to make more cars, essentially. And that would be a type of reproduction in artifacts. Now, I want to point out at this juncture a major distinction between the biotic side of that diagram and the abiotic side. And that is, in biology, the phenotype has the genotype, the means of producing the individual, all within the same entity. Whereas in artifacts, the phenotype, which is the artifact, the genotype, which is the instruction set, and the means of building the artifact, which would be the factory, are separate entities. So going back to the diagram, DNA is within the cells, so the zygote has all of the information in it to build the full phenotype. So it has the information and then the cellular machinery to build the individual. In the artifacts, the instruction set is used in a factory, again, if you're building cars, to produce the artifact. So the instructions, the mechanism to build the artifact, and the artifact itself are three separate entities. And I would say the artifact is the analog of the phenotype for the artifacts. Being a reproductive evolutionary biologist, I'm interested in reproduction, and just wanted to point out that in technology, I believe there are two types of reproduction. The one I just outlined, where you use the same instructions to build more artifacts, and then a second type, which is using profits to make more factories. And by doing so, you have copied the instructions into a new factory, and then you have another mechanism of putting out more artifacts of that particular type. So an example might be franchises of McDonald's hamburgers. So the instruction set for making hamburgers can be replicated into various franchises. In each franchise, you use the same instructions to make more and more hamburgers, but then you can duplicate that set of instructions to different franchises and have yet more hamburgers built in McDonald's. So this is the second type of reproduction where the even more profits are used to replicate the factory and replicate the instruction set. So those two things could combine to replicate the artifacts. Another aspect of this idea that I just want to point out is in biology, we use a term, evolutionary biology, we use a term called fitness, which is basically some estimate of how well a particular type of organism does relative to other types. In biology, we use survivorship and reproduction as our measurement of fitness. So the probability of surviving of a particular type and its lifetime reproductive output, expected reproductive output. In technology, what I would suggest would be an analog of this would be the amount of money accumulated by the sales of the artifact. So if you go back to this diagram, we talked about energy acquisition by an individual, that part is used as maintenance, and then excess is used for growth and reproduction. We, in biology, don't measure energy acquisition as a measure of fitness, but it would be a completely viable measure of fitness. It's just extremely hard to quantify. So instead, we look at probability of surviving and reproduction. In sales of artifacts, we monitor, as a society, we monitor sales extremely vigorously. And so there's lots of information about money acquisition. So I would argue that would be a good kind of fitness analog for evolution at the level of the artifact. I should also note the generation of variation. This is really, really an important aspect of this. In biology, we have two major ways in which variation is generated. One, and this is the one that we talk about the most, is mutation in the instruction set, the DNA, that will cause a new genotype, essentially, a new variant of the genotype. And oftentimes it's point mutations or single nucleotide polymorphisms that occur randomly in duplication of the DNA. So this is random genetic variation, some of which is good, most of which is not good. Then there is the rearrangement of the code, which comes in chromosomes, so that the linear set of code can be reorganized in different ways. One occurs during meiosis through a process called crossing over, and then there's other types of chromosomal rearrangements that can occur. So that is another form of variation. We think of this variation as being random, though you can make arguments about crossing over and the like as not being random. But generally, the variation is random, and that's an important aspect of how fast biology evolves, the organisms evolve. In technology, we could have random mistakes in copying the instructions. When I was a kid, there was ads about Reese's peanut butter cups, and they said some person bumped into another person and they had a a chocolate bar and they got into the peanut butter, and the peanut butter got in the chocolate bar, and they said, oh, you've got peanut butter in my chocolate and you got chocolate in my peanut butter. And they're like, oh, this is great. And so that's how Reese's peanut butter cups were developed. I don't think necessarily that's the case, but that would be a type of random variant in the instruction set for making chocolate bars, let's say, that could turn out to be good. I think this is probably not likely to be an important aspect of technology evolution. Instead, in technology evolution, artifact evolution, there are individuals that look at current technology and try to make a better type, like Edison making a better type of lighting, or individuals trying to add variant forms to get at more of the market. So this is more like a directed mutations, if you will, where human inventors and R&D departments specifically try to modify instructions to make something better. Okay, and in a lot of literature I read, this is where technology evolution occurs. And that inside companies, they have R&D departments and they test out different things, and then eventually they bring it to the market. But it seems from what I read that the variants are then given to the consumers, and that's how it evolves. But anytime you have two or more types of a artifact, you will have the opportunity for selection to occur among those artifact types. So that this is an important aspect, and this is an aspect that will absolutely allow technology to evolve at a higher rate than random variation in biology. But I'm arguing that this presents variants to the consumers, and then the consumers choose among the variants. Now, they might not have as broad a range if an R&D department decides not to present certain things, but they still have the opportunity to select. Okay, and I'm running through time here. So some testable predictions I think you can make using this idea of selection at the level of the artifact. Going back to quantitative genetics, here's another very simple equation in quantitative genetics, which is response to selection is equal to the heritability of the type being selected times something called a selective coefficient, or a strength of selection. So response to selection is just some measure of the adaptation of the variants being selected to selection. Heritability is what we talked about before, which is the proportion of the total phenotypic variation that's due to genetics. And so that's VG over VG plus VE. If you remember, this is the instruction set variation. This is the variation that is not included in the instruction set for artifacts. And then VP would be the total variation of the artifacts. Strength of selection is something that I haven't brought up. It's basically related to the percentage of the total variant pool that is being selected on. And the smaller the pool that is being selected, the greater the strength of selection. So this is an example from cows being selected for longer horns. This curve here is the total, basically normal curve of horn length for cows in this population. Let's say they chose, I don't know what the proportion is, let's say it's 15% of the total variants that are the highest 15% in horn length. The strength of selection is just the difference in the mean of those selected from the overall mean of the population. And as you can see, if this proportion is smaller, the strength would be greater. If the proportion is greater, the strength would be smaller. Okay, so you can use this simple equation to make a few predictions. One is that a higher response to consumer selection would occur with a lower proportion of the variant types being selected by the consumer. This is something I did myself. This is from 2021, I went through and looked at all the gas mileage, miles per gallon in the United States for different sedans. And you can see it's a very skewed distribution. So this is the median here of the entire distribution. And let's say that gas prices went up dramatically. It's just hypothetical, not that that's happening now. And so the consumers were laser beam focused on only buying cars that had the highest gas mileage. And let's say, just as an example, the top 25% were chosen. And only those cars were sold. In this case, the strength of selection would be the difference in the median for the portion that is being sold relative to the overall median. And as you can guess, you can make a prediction that in markets where the selection isn't this tight, that gas mileage would not change in sedans very quickly, but under circumstances where the environment, where the artificial selection environment only picked a small portion of the total variant pool, you can imagine that you'd have a much faster rate of adaptation of gas mileage over time. Prediction 2 would be all else being equal, if VE is higher, then the response to selection would be muted. So this is also from the web. One instruction set, one recipe for chocolate chip cookies, and the bake. So the bake is exactly the same, using 4 different types of flour. And you can see there's variation in the output, the cookie, only on the basis of the different types of flour that's being used. So I would argue that artifacts that have a higher level of this kind of environmental variation should respond more slowly to artificial selection relative to ones that have their instruction set extremely specified, so that there isn't this kind of variation one individual to the next that isn't coded for in the instructions. Finally, you should have a higher response to selection with a greater number of variants to select among. So for example, going back to the cars, if there's lots of variant car options, you should have a higher ability for the car market to respond to artificial selection relative to a market has very few options. You could make, say, a prediction that markets that, like state-run markets that really constrain the options, should evolve their artifacts more slowly than, say, capitalist markets that have lots and lots of variation. Okay, so there's lots of challenges to these ideas, but I just want to point out a few. Again, I'm running out of time, sorry. How do you quantify adaptation? Now, in biology, we kind of get around this by looking at single trait selection, like in the gas mileage example. So that is one way of dealing with quantifying adaptation, where you pick something out specific and look at its modification over time. We also compare overall fitness, as I mentioned before, to try to assess one type to another in a species, let's say, or among species. So I mentioned that profit might be a way to assess the overall fitness of an artifact. You might say that customer satisfaction would be another mechanism to try to quantify, but that's an interesting argument. Also, what are the artifacts adapting to? Well, if it's sales on an open market, it would be the choice of the consumers. And what does that choice reflect? I'm arguing that's like the needs and slash desires of the individuals, but not entirely sure that's true. And it's effectuated by exchange of money. And so this is basically human choice as passed along by money exchange. And different consumers will have different value of their money. And so that could have a major impact on adaptation to consumption. Again, quickly, just to conclude, I am arguing that not only does technology evolve at the level of firms, as outlined by other authors, but also at the level of the artifact itself. We can show that there's artifact variation from lots of different types of artifacts, which I would consider phenotypic variation at the level of the artifact, that the instruction sets used to build artifacts are analog of genotype, that sales of the artifacts on the open market are the artificial selection environment that is selecting among the artifact types by consumers, that money can be considered the same as energy and be used as a measure of fitness, and that it's really important that we have directed mutations in artifacts that allow non-random changes in the phenotypes that can make things a lot better and can be quickly selected on by the consumers. The benefits, I think, of looking at it from this perspective is artifacts have a much faster turnover rate than firms. And so there's a shorter generation time, and inheritance is very easy to quantify in instructions. And then there's some quantifiable predictions, but I have already outlined, and I ran out of time, as Jeff noted, so I am done. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm very interested in getting feedback from you all on these ideas.
Thanks very much, Stephen. That's very interesting. Dick Langlois, would you like to ask a question? Dick?
Yes, if I can turn things on. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I thought this was wonderful, very, very interesting. I want to push a little bit, though, on the idea that recipes evolving and artifacts evolving are sort of the same thing. You know, when I was a kid, I used to read a lot of science fiction, and there were always stories of the form. There's a civilization that evolves, that arises, and it builds these things, and then it collapses, you know, apocalypse or something, and leaves behind these artifacts. And then another civilization comes along, and it discovers these artifacts, and it's able to build them much faster than the original civilization took to build them, right? And this is not, you know, unrealistic. If you think about the Japanese auto industry after World War II, Toyota sort of invented its own routines for how to make cars. They knew what a car looked like, and they could reverse engineer the car, right? And so ways of doing things really are there's many different ways to do things. And I think what really evolves is the design. And I was really struck with the cornets and all of that kind of the knives. What's really evolving is the design, and there are many ways to design to build. There are many recipes that will get to those designs, and there's no one-to-one mapping between recipes and designs. And recipes, so the way I think about it, these are two different evolutionary processes. The production process evolves, and the artifact evolves, but they're potentially different things. And so the production process can evolve, but I can learn how to make cars, and then I can make tractors and motorcycles instead with that same production process. But those are very different designs from the cars that are being made. And I have this sense that design is a thing. And there's information contained in a design, and it's that information that's evolving, and that's not all that tightly linked to the recipes, or at least to the routines that are used to do that.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's information in the artifact itself, and I definitely don't, even though I'm a biologist, I don't want to imply there's a one-to-one absolute mapping of technology evolution onto biology. Just like in that cornet phylogeny, right? There's interesting information transfer that goes between lineages that you don't commonly find in biology. So I absolutely agree that the artifact has its own information, and you can copy that. And I guess what I would just suggest is that you would create a new instruction set that grabbed information as well as you could reverse engineer it into another instruction set. So it's kind of like grabbing stuff from one cornet type to another through that process. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah, although if we discovered old artifacts, we would make them in a very different way now, right? We
Right.
would use plastics or whatever that they didn't have, right?
Right, right.
Okay. Armin.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the talk. Appreciate it. I just have like a two-sided question. I was surprised that you didn't talk about work in gene culture coevolutionary theory, because that sounds like it would be exactly up your alley. They have very similar models where they sort of look at, you know, the relationship between the phenotype and, say, genetic factors and the evolution of whatever ethnic markers, or in fact technologies. They have very similar stuff on, you know, speed of evolution changing. So that's sort of one stuff. It'd be great if you can say a little bit about how this relates to work in gene culture coevolutionary theory. And the other side of this is work in niche construction theory, which is the other obvious place to look for here. So you can think maybe in relation to what Dick was just saying too, like artifacts as they evolve, they should have changed the niche of artifact engineering down the road. And so this sort of feedback modeling that people have done in the work on niche construction, I think would also be sort of an obvious place to look at. So if you could say maybe one or both, like how does this relate to the Boyd and Richardson, Henrik et al. Line versus the Odling, Smee, and niche construction sort of world? That'd be great.
Okay, so this is exactly why I wanted to present here. So I have not been brought up in this line, right, of intellectual thought, and this is the very first time I've heard of either one of those. So I don't know anything about them. I would be very happy, you know. I don't know how many of you try to do cross-disciplinary work, but it's difficult to find information if you don't know the right search terms and the literature and things like that. So I don't know if you could put into the chat or somehow give me the both of those lines of thought, then I could look them up, because I'm very interested in exactly why I would like to present to you, because I know that I'm missing literature. So I don't know anything about that, to be honest. Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry, I'll just email you the highlights of some of the stuff. Not a problem. It's probably
Okay.
easier than in the chat.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dietrich.
Hi there. Yeah, so thank you for the talk. I was actually going to say something very similar to Armin, so I'll let him send you those references. There's actually a whole cultural evolution society. You might want to check out their webpage. And although they say cultural evolution, probably like 95% of what they're talking about is actually technology. That's the most common one.
Okay.
But what I wanted to ask about actually is something that I think that literature has a problem with, which is the concept of fitness as applied to culture and also specifically technology. And it was nice. So in biological evolution, as I understand it, well, let me take it. So, like, creationists like to say that, you know, Darwinism is circular, right? Because you just say the fittest survive, and how do we know what's fit? It's what survives. And, like, of course, this is false, because the measure of fitness, as I understand, same thing. You just say, why does this particular feature enhance reproduction? You know, and so it gets selected because of its links to fitness. So there's like a third thing in there. But in the cultural evolutionary literature, and other people have said this, it's not clear what the third thing is. It's sort of, we assess the fitness of technological variants by the fact that they reproduce, you know, and it comes close to being circular. We need to understand what drives. Now, you've suggested sort of monetary returns to funds, to firms, and maybe that works in a particular market economy, but it leaves also unknown exactly what is being selected for that makes the monetary returns higher. And I think this is a big problem, because it can change, it can vary across individuals. I don't know, just the concept of fitness applied to cultural and technological. We tend to think it's easier in technology because we think, oh, artifacts get better. But get better at what? You know, you use lots of examples like, you know, today's cars are better than the Model T. Well, only on certain metrics and for certain people. You know, if you live next to one of these places where they mine the rare earth elements for the batteries, you might not think it's actually better. So it's always like, how do we define it and how do we avoid being pretty much completely subjective as to what we consider to be a fitness measurement? That's kind of my concern, if you would want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, in biology, I mean, we have a similar issue, and we tend to get around it by just picking things, like right, like horn length, or like in my area, types of reproductive differences, right? So we're picking out of a pool of all the right, because you select on the basis of the entire individual, right? And so that's it's hard to measure all those things. And so we'll pick certain things like whether or not you reproduce once in your life, or you and die, or reproduce many times, and right. And then try to assess fitness of those two types. So we've already predetermined what we're going to compare, right? And so that was kind of what I was saying with looking at gas mileage. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, if you sort of define, and, you know, I guess within a circumscribed particular cultural context, particular period of history, we can say, well, in fact, we know that people wanted to get higher gas mileage, you know, and so that's okay. It's just sort of, you know, I'm an archaeologist, and one of the areas where you get actually a lot of this literature on artifact evolution is in archaeology and projectile point types and all this kind of thing. It's always concerned me that we don't actually know what people wanted. And there's a lot of assumption that we can figure out what they wanted from what replicated, which is just, I mean, it's problematic. So I think if you're in a particular historical context where you know that in the post-war era, there was a big state push to develop this type of technology, I think you can say, well, yes, that's what people wanted. But it also strikes me as a very idiosyncratic kind of case in terms of the evolution of technology more broadly.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. We, like I said, in biology, what we would do is there would be a theory for why you would expect this to evolve in this circumstance and this in another, and then we would go test that particular aspect of the overall biology. So I guess if you had something similar in you know, axes or whatever it might be, you might be able to test that. I don't know.
Yeah, people, I mean, you know, we measure performance characteristics, but again, it's hard because, you know, again, you're sort of injecting like, well, I think they probably wanted the sharpest thing. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, maybe they did,
Yeah.
maybe they didn't. All right. Well, I don't want to hog the conversation, but I do think that, and this is recognized in the cultural evolutionary literature, that the task of defining and measuring fitness in a way that's outside of the theory that you have is a challenge.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Dietrich. Marion. Marion?
Yeah. There, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
This may be somewhat related to what the last two questions. Oh, I was happy to see you recognize George Masal's book. I thought that was a wonderful early book on technological evolution. But this may be related to a couple of the comments that have already been made, that you built the foundation of your view of cultural evolution on traditional population genetics. And that there's a significant movement these days amongst biologists to argue that that is an inadequate view of biological evolution. And there's a whole bunch of things that they usually include, but things like inductive forward-acting environmental influences on phenotypes, niche construction, plasticity, epigenetic inheritance, and so on and so forth. That whole movement might also be, many of the things in it are relevant to the kind of questions that would be asked about your building up in your presentation of cultural evolution, I think.
Thank you. Yeah.
I could send you a bunch, but if you're not familiar with that literature, I could send you a bunch of references.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. No one else in the queue, so I'll have a go. I'm very interested in your talk, Stephen.
Thank you.
It's very stimulating to see something which is similar to way you've been thinking, but challenging in certain important ways. So my point would be to do a very brief comparison of your framework and the framework that Gilbert Knudsen and I developed. You do kindly mention that. It seems to me, comment if you think I'm wrong, but the big difference between the two frameworks is you relax our assumption that replicators are carried by interactors. Okay, so basically you can have replicators separate from interactors, like Dick Langworth's story, science fiction story of one civilization leaving a load of instructions and another coming in and then doing its own thing with that. Now, I mean, there's no religious text which says we have to do it one way or the other, but it's still it's interesting to tease this out and what that will mean. I mean, a lot of the discussion when you're generalizing across domains depends on the use of words and what particular words mean, because you're dealing in different contexts, different communities, and meanings don't always translate very easily. So if you did relax that assumption, the Hodgson-Knudsen version would be a subset, okay, of this even more general Darwinism that you're proposing. Now, does that kind of make sense to you? I mean, because I think this will be useful to explore.
So I wasn't thinking of it that way. I was thinking that there are different levels of selection, and that the firm selection and routines inside of companies, it totally seems valid to me. And I don't see why that isn't happening.
Yeah.
And it has obviously an effect. I don't know, obviously, but it seems like it reasonable that would have an effect on the outcome of technology. And so I think that's happening. I mean, I have no argument why that's not happening. But what I'm saying is I think there's a different level, which is individuals picking among different artifact types that have a high heritability in the different variant types. And then that can pass that set of selected traits. And again, what are those traits exactly? But some set of traits on to future generations of technology. Yeah. So I would say that they're happening in concert, and that so you might be able to.
Yeah, but there is a difference, isn't there, okay, Stephen? I mean, we have a multi-level story too, Hodgson, and this is based on the replicator-interactor distinction, which we get originally in the replicators Dawkins, and then there's been modified definitions. So we have that two-tier story. So when firms are selected, some prosper and others get bankrupted. That affects the routines in them as well. And some of the routines don't survive the extermination of some firms, and some routines prosper because they work and the firms make profits and so on, and they're replicated in different ways. That's fine, but I mean, you're separating, you're going beyond the necessary condition. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but you're going beyond the condition that all replicators are carried within in some hosted by interactors. That gives you the two-level selection. But if you relax that assumption and you have them floating separate, I'm not saying it's wrong, you have an interesting complication.
Okay, yeah.
In that two-level story.
Right. And so I would suggest that, like within a firm, you could have this kind of evolution occurring of the technologies that they're making, right? And so that you could have that turning over in addition to firms doing better one to the other kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, still think it's more involves more than that. To tease it out a different way, the two frameworks, mine and yours, are very similar, but you and one of the similarities is the replicator is highly informational. It's basically an information-based concept of a replicator. But the way that we conceive of that, because we have this embedded condition, is different. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. I mean, you have recipes in yours. We would have something about the community which is able to understand and interpret the recipes, but it's not necessarily one way or the other. But there are differences, which I think are worth exploring. And I'm not saying that the way we did it was right. And I think well, that's why I found your talk interesting, because it did tease out those issues.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else like to raise a point? Well, perhaps one thing I was thinking when you were kind enough to show me your thoughts before, and I think the discussion has been very useful. I don't know if you find so yourself, but
yeah,
you're bridging out from being a biologist into this other area where there's a lot of other things and other literatures you need to look at, like genetic inheritance, cultural evolution, and so on. That's important. But where would you go with this? What kind of forum journal would you go and look for?
Well, that was what I had originally reached out to you for advice on.
Yeah.
I don't know. In fact, the one that I had suggested, now I can't even remember what it was, but you said, "Oh, no, this is not a good one to do." So
I forgot what I said, but yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I think the technology thing would interest a lot of people, and that's your selling point, because you're focusing on technology. And so a technology journal might be interested. I mean, there's some of the resistance to your ideas would be the Darwinism. Okay, and I'm not suggesting you change that, but some social scientists have this kind of gut reaction. Oh, you can't do that. Can't do that. It's different. Social evolution is very different. Of course, it's different, as you said yourself.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it's not common principles between the two, and we can learn from biology as much as the other way around. Yeah, so that makes a choice. I mean, maybe technology journal, evolution journal, and also the Journal of Evolution Economics is a bit of a Russian roulette, because if it goes to an anti-Darwinian referee, they won't like it. If it goes to someone who's more sympathetic, you could be on your way. Another one would be the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, or one of the cultural evolution journals if you linked up with that literature.
Okay.
But I think selling. I think if you reviewed the problems, and with Sal's book, everyone says it's good, and I found it really inspiring, but we did find it limited in terms of our framework. I mean, if you can review the different problems that arise in different ways of looking at this technology issue, maybe your idea of recipes is some way forward. But a review of that to make us think about what differs between different frameworks and what the advantages are. I mean, you're selling yourself very much on testability, which is great, but we also need some conceptual clarity and translation as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I was hoping at some point maybe to get a co-author because I know that there's a vast literature out there that I haven't had the time to read and don't even know where to go. And so some of the comments were quite helpful for that. But yeah, if I could find somebody who knew the problems better than I do, that would be super helpful.
Yeah. Marion, do you want to come back? Marion?
I think you're
muted.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, okay.
That you may be interested in the Cultural Evolution Society's meeting. They're meeting in July, I think it is. And I think you can go do them online as well as in person sometimes. So you might want to look into that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've been watching the talks on this in this forum also, and it's been very enlightening. Thank you.
Oh, I enjoyed your talk, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for showing up.
Yeah. Thanks very much indeed. It is very stimulating to see an expert biologist come in and try and deal with some of our problems and with the insights from your field. So thanks very much indeed, Stephen. It's been great. Don't hesitate to contact us if you want to discuss anything else. But I think the advice you've been given from others is very good.
Yeah.
Particularly looking
Thanks.
at the cultural evolution issues.
I am going
and
to.
Marianne's point about what you might call the new biology, I think, is also relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's exciting stuff. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, and we close the meeting. Thank you.